They made a list. Oh yes, they made a very detailed, very organized, very bureaucratically thorough list of every species they had conquered, catalogued, and in some cases simply erased from the galactic record, like a typo in a history book. The Vreth Dominion was nothing if not meticulous about their atrocities. They kept files, they issued receipts. There was reportedly a whole department dedicated to documentation, staffed by low-ranking Vreth clerks who processed extinction events the way other civilizations processed tax returns, and for 340 years, the galaxy let them do it. Not because the other species were cowards, mind you. Well, some of them were, but mostly it was mathematics. The Vreth were simply too large, too fast, too well-armed, and too completely devoid of anything resembling guilt to fight head-on. The Solari Collective tried diplomacy. The Vreth ate their ambassador, not metaphorically, not as an insult, but literally consumed the poor creature during the opening reception and then asked if there was a second course. The Polani remnants tried guerrilla tactics. 17 engagements, 17 losses. The Polani eventually relocated to an asteroid belt on the outer rim and started a fishing colony, which honestly respect. The Dotheki attempted an alliance of 17 species. They drafted the treaty, signed the treaty, celebrated the treaty, and then watched the Vreth casually dismantle 8 of the 17 member worlds before the ink was metaphorically dry. The point is, the Vreth had a system, and the system worked, right up until Sector 7 Gamma. Now, Sector 7 Gamma was not, by any galactic standard, impressive. It sat at the fringe of charted space, far from the major trade corridors, nowhere near a decent nebula or a strategically significant jump gate. Its primary star was a medium-sized, rather ordinary yellow dwarf, the cosmic equivalent of a beige wall in an unremarkable hallway. The Vreth survey drones catalogued the system in 0.003 seconds and assigned it a threat rating of 0.1, which was the same score they gave to uninhabited moons and mild solar weather. The single inhabited planet in the system, third from the star, lush blue-green, embarrassingly pretty, had been flagged for standard processing. Standard processing meant land, demand tribute, kill anyone who argues, take the resources, and leave enough alive to serve as a labor force. Clean, efficient. The whole thing usually took a week, sometimes less if the locals were sensible. The locals were not sensible. The locals were, in fact, humans. And here is where the story gets interesting, because if you had asked any Vreth commander at that moment what a human was, they would have stared at you with those flat, reflective eyes of theirs and said, a Category 3 pre-stellar biological unit with no relevant defensive capability. They had looked at the humans' weapons. The humans had projectile launchers, which the Vreth found quaint. They had aircraft, which the Vreth found adorable. They had a handful of orbital defense platforms that a single Vreth cruiser could dismantle before breakfast. What the Vreth survey drones had failed to properly assess, what no galactic power had properly assessed, because no galactic power had been stupid enough to actually go to war with humans yet, was the following. Humans were not dangerous because of their weapons. Humans were dangerous because of what happened inside their heads when someone threatened the things they loved. The commander who led the initial landing force was named Vreth Doris. Tall, gray, 7 limbs, the kind of face that would cause a small child to flee screaming, and I mean that as a compliment among his people. He had conducted 47 planetary subjugations without incident. He was, by Vreth standards, excellent at his job. He landed outside a human settlement in the northern continent. He issued the standard Vreth Declaration of Conquest, which had been translated into every known language by their communication drones. The declaration was thorough. It covered ownership transfer of all planetary resources, the immediate cessation of any governing bodies, and a helpful glossary of acceptable behaviors for newly subjugated populations. It was, by all accounts, a very professional document. A woman named Petra Okafor stood at the edge of the landing zone with her arms crossed and read the declaration on her handheld screen. She was a city administrator. She managed water treatment schedules and road repair contracts and noise complaint disputes between neighbors. She was 43 years old, wore reading glasses, and had a half-eaten energy bar in her jacket pocket. She looked up at Vreth Doris and said, "No, just no." One word, flat as a tabletop. Doris had not. In 47 planetary subjugations, ever received a one-word response to the declaration. He processed it for a moment. His translation unit confirmed the word. He checked it twice because surely there was a linguistic nuance he was missing. There wasn't. The human had simply said no. He took a step forward to clarify the situation, and Petra Okafor said, "I'd recommend you don't do that," in the exact same tone she used when she told contractors their bid was too high. Doris did it anyway. Petra threw the energy bar at him, turned around, and walked calmly back into the settlement, which from a military standpoint accomplished nothing. But from a cultural standpoint, it was essentially a declaration of war delivered with the energy of someone who had a meeting in 10 minutes and didn't have time for this. What followed was not at first what anyone would call an organized resistance. It was messier than that. It was louder than that. The humans didn't have a coordinated military response pre-planned because honestly, they had not truly believed this particular Tuesday would be the day alien invaders showed up. They had bills to pay. Some of them had kids at school. A mechanic named Toby Ferreira was in the middle of replacing a fuel coupling when the sirens started and just never stopped working on that coupling. Just kept going, because what else do you do? But here is what happened, and here is what the Vreth did not understand, and here is the part that the rest of the galaxy would later study very carefully in their respective equivalents of military academies. The humans got mad. Not scared. Mad. Vreth Doris's first ground unit was a 12-vehicle armored column moving through an agricultural zone. They destroyed 3 farms, 2 storage facilities, and a weather monitoring station. Standard intimidation protocol, calculated to demonstrate overwhelming force and motivate compliance. What it actually motivated was a retired soldier named Agustin Reyes, who heard the column from his porch, walked inside, opened a storage cabinet he had not opened in 11 years, and got to work. Within 4 hours he had organized 31 people from the surrounding area into a coherent strike unit. They had hunting weapons. They had farming equipment. They had 1 military-grade armored vehicle that Augustin had very technically legally purchased at a government surplus auction years ago and had been using to haul grain. They hit the Vreth column from 3 sides in a drainage ditch off a dirt road, destroyed 2 vehicles, and were gone before the Vreth response units arrived. Doris looked at the after-action report and experienced, for the first time in his career, confusion. The attackers had used cover. They had coordinated without visible communication devices. He later learned they had used a combination of hand signals and, no, he wasn't joking, a series of specific whistle patterns Augustin had invented on the spot. They had aimed for gaps in the armor plating, which meant they had looked at Vreth war machines for less than 4 hours and already identified the structural vulnerabilities. He sent an urgent update to the Vreth Fleet Command. Fleet Command sent back a memo telling him to proceed with standard protocol. Doris would later describe this as the worst professional advice he had ever received. Over the next 6 days, every single standard protocol action the Vreth took produced the same baffling result. More humans, angrier, better organized, and visibly learning. They learned in real time. They failed at something once and then never failed at that specific thing again. They shared information with each other across the continent through every available method: broadcasts, written notes, hand-carried messages. At one point, a teenager named Yara Mensa bicycled 40 kilometers through occupied territory to deliver a schematic of the Vreth assault armor's power coupling configuration that her uncle, an electrical engineer named Bao Whitfield, had reverse-engineered from a destroyed unit in his garage. Bao Whitfield had reverse-engineered alien military technology in his garage in 6 days, with tools he normally used to fix home appliances. Doris stopped sleeping, which for a Vreth was physiologically unusual and medically concerning. By day 9 he had lost contact with 2 full ground companies. Not destroyed, gone. The humans had learned to capture Vreth soldiers, restrain them with improvised but surprisingly effective binding techniques, and hold them somewhere. He didn't know where. He didn't know how they were even restraining creatures twice their body mass, until he received footage from a recovered drone, showing a group of 12 humans coordinating a capture operation with a level of calm, methodical teamwork that frankly made his own units look sloppy. He requested reinforcements. Fleet Command asked how a pre-stellar species with projectile weapons was causing this level of operational disruption. Doris, to his credit, told them the truth. He didn't know. but he strongly suggested they take it seriously. Fleet Command sent one additional cruiser and told him to stop embarrassing the Dominion. That cruiser, captained by a decorated officer named Vreth Dominion, entered the upper atmosphere on day 11 and conducted a standard orbital pressure bombardment of 3 locations flagged as resistance coordination sites. Clinical, professional, overwhelming. Core had not received the update about what humans do when you threaten the things they love. After the bombardment, Core prepared a full ground assault to consolidate the planet. On the surface below, the resistance went quiet for exactly 4 hours. Then it got very, very creative. 4 hours of silence from humans, it turned out, was not a good sign. It was the opposite of a good sign. It was, in hindsight, the most terrifying 4 hours in the operational history of the Vreth Dominion. They just didn't know it yet, because the silence felt like surrender, and the Vreth were very comfortable with surrender. Surrender was familiar. Surrender was on page 1 of the standard protocol manual. Surrender came with paperwork they already knew how to file. What was actually happening during those 4 hours was this. Petra Okafor, Augustin Reyes, Bao Whitfield, Yara Mensa, Toby Ferreira, and approximately 900 other humans across the continent were sitting in basements and barns and repurposed storage facilities having the most concentrated, focused, furious planning sessions in the history of a species that had, over its long and turbulent existence, planned a rather extraordinary number of things under pressure. Petra was running the coordination. She had a wall covered in handwritten notes, 3 battery-powered communication relays that Bao had assembled from salvaged Vreth drone components, and a mug of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and that she kept forgetting to drink. She had not slept. She did not look like she needed to. She looked like someone had aimed her at a problem, and she intended to go straight through it. Augustin was running tactical. He had stopped being a retired soldier approximately 9 days ago, and had become something the Vreth did not have a classification for. A man with nothing to lose, 30 years of accumulated knowledge, and the specific, quiet fury of someone who had watched the bombardment footage and recognized 2 of the 3 locations that had been hit. He hadn't said anything about it. He had just looked at the footage for a long moment and then gone back to the maps. Bao Whitfield had been awake for 31 hours and was operating at a level of engineering focus that his wife, watching from the corner of the room, described later as terrifying in a way I found oddly attractive. He had taken apart 4 Vreth weapon systems, understood the energy discharge frequency of the Vreth cruiser's orbital cannons, and was building something in a crate that he refused to explain to anyone until it was finished. Yara Mensa, who was 17 years old and had originally been asked to stay somewhere safe, had instead become the most effective intelligence courier in the operation, knew the patrol patterns of every Vreth ground unit in a 40-kilometer radius, and had at some point during the chaos designed a coded signal system using commercial weather balloons that was now being used across 3 separate resistance cells. When Petra found out about the balloon system, she stared at Yara for a long moment and said, "You're terrifying," which Yara accepted as the highest possible compliment. Toby Ferreira had finished replacing that fuel coupling. He had also, in the intervening 9 days, repaired, modified, and in 2 cases significantly upgraded every piece of mechanical equipment the Resistance had access to. He was currently explaining to a group of farmers how to modify their industrial agricultural drones for a purpose that the drones' manufacturers had absolutely not intended and would have voided the warranty over. The point is, the 4 hours were not silence. The 4 hours were the sound of 900 humans, frightened and grieving and absolutely incandescent with anger, deciding in complete agreement on one specific thing: enough. Vreth Dominion received the first indication that something was wrong when his ground assault units began reporting communication interference 40 minutes into the landing operation. Not jamming, exactly. More like the signals were being redirected, bounced, scattered through a frequency pattern that his communications officers had never encountered. They spent 20 minutes trying to diagnose it before someone thought to check the sky and noticed that the cloud cover had an unusual number of small reflective objects moving through it in organized patterns. Weather balloons. Modified weather balloons. Core stared at the sensor readout and said, in Vreth, something that translates roughly to, "You cannot be serious." He was, unfortunately, completely serious. The ground assault hit the first resistance position and found it empty. Not abandoned in a hurry, empty on purpose, cleanly, with deliberate intent, as if the humans had wanted the Vreth to come exactly here, to this specific position, at this specific time. Kor's unit commander flagged this as potentially concerning. Kor told him to proceed. The manual said that when you found an empty position, you secured it and moved forward. The manual had not been written with Augustin Reyes in mind. The Vreth column moved through the empty position and into a narrow agricultural valley, because the route through the valley was the most direct path to the flagged coordination site, and the Vreth were operating on a timetable. The valley had high berms on both sides, irrigation infrastructure running along the ridgelines, and at the far end, what appeared on the drone footage to be an abandoned equipment depot. What the drone footage had not captured, because Bao Whitfield had spent 6 hours figuring out the precise reflective frequency of the Vreth sensor arrays and had coated everything in a layer of modified agricultural polymer that scattered that frequency beautifully, was the following. 412 humans, distributed along both ridgelines and through the equipment depot, armed with a combination of conventional weapons, captured Vreth equipment, and 17 of Toby Ferreira's modified agricultural drones, each one carrying a payload that Toby had described, with characteristic understatement, as a significant amount of stored kinetic energy. Augustin gave the signal at the moment the entire column was in the valley. It was not a whistle this time. It was just him tapping Petra on the shoulder, and Petra pressing a button on a device Bao had built, and then the valley becoming briefly and comprehensively very loud. Kor received the distress signal from his ground column, 11 seconds into the engagement. By the time he had processed it, the engagement was already over, not because it had been won by either side, but because the humans had not actually been trying to destroy the column. They had been trying to stop it, pin it, hold it completely immobile in that valley while something else happened. That something else was Yara Mensa. Specifically, it was Yara Mensa, in a stolen Vreth atmospheric scout craft that she had learned to pilot from a technical manual that Bao had translated from captured Vreth data cores, flying at very low altitude toward the landing ship that Kor's ground forces had come from. She was not a trained pilot. She had read the manual 3 times and watched Bao's translated instructional notes twice and had told Petra, with the absolute confidence of someone who had not yet accumulated enough experience to know what to be afraid of, I can do this. She could, mostly, do this. The landing ship's automated defense systems registered her approach and flagged it as a potential threat, and then immediately unflagged it because the craft she was flying had full Vreth identification codes and was transmitting the correct authorization frequencies, because Bao Whitfield had pulled those codes from the captured data cores and installed them, and because the automated defense system had absolutely no protocol for what if the ship with the correct codes is being flown by an angry 17-year-old human. Yara brought the scout craft into the landing ship's open maintenance bay, which was standard procedure for a returning scout. The bay doors were automated and opened on the correct signal. She set it down, admittedly harder than the manual recommended, and climbed out carrying a pack that Bao had prepared, and that contained, as he had explained to her with great technical precision and considerable visible anxiety, enough disruption to make a significant impression. She planted it in the maintenance bay's primary power coupling access point, because Bao had explained exactly where that was, and exactly why it mattered. Set the timer for 4 minutes, walked back to the scout craft, and then realized she had been so focused on the planting that she had not fully thought through the leaving part. She improvised, which was, by this point, a very human thing to do. Kor received 3 simultaneous alerts in the space of about 90 seconds. His ground column was requesting emergency extraction. His landing ship's internal systems were showing a critical power disruption in the maintenance sector, and an unscheduled scout craft was exiting his landing ship's bay at an angle and speed that the automated systems classified as non-standard departure procedure, which was doing a lot of heavy lifting as a description. He had, in 41 years of service, never experienced 3 simultaneous emergencies. The Vreth doctrine on simultaneous emergencies was clear. Prioritize by threat level, address in sequence, maintain composure. His composure lasted about 4 more seconds, which was when the landing ship's primary power system went down, and the ship listed 17 degrees to the left, and the emergency lighting came on, and somewhere in the maintenance section, something made a very loud noise that the ship's damage report described as catastrophic sequential failure, and that Bow Whitfield would later describe, with enormous satisfaction, as working exactly as intended. The cruiser in orbit above, captained by Vreth Dominion, who was now operating from emergency command protocols in a tilting ship with no primary power, sent an urgent transmission to Vreth Fleet Command. Fleet Command, receiving now the second urgent transmission in 11 days from the same planet that had been rated at threat level 0.1, did something the Vreth Dominion had not done in 160 years. They called a command council. Now, and this is important, a Vreth command council was not a quick process. It involved 17 senior fleet commanders, a full threat reassessment panel, a documentation review of all existing operational reports, and a preliminary debate period that, under standard procedure, lasted no fewer than 6 standard days. The Vreth were nothing if not thorough about their bureaucracy, even in emergencies, perhaps especially in emergencies, because the Vreth had found over their centuries of conquest that bureaucracy was comforting, and right now Fleet Command needed comfort. They needed comfort because the operational reports from Sector 7 Gamma were doing something that operational reports were not supposed to do. They were getting worse every day. Not worse in the sense of we are suffering losses, though they were. Worse in the sense that the resistance was learning faster than the Vreth could adapt. Every countermeasure produced a human adaptation within hours. Every new tactic met a response that was different from the last response. Creative in a way that felt almost personal, as if the humans were not just fighting back but were actively interested in the Vreth as a problem to be solved. One analyst noted, in a report that circulated quietly through the command council, that the humans appeared to treat warfare the way they treated engineering, as a system with rules that could be understood, broken down and improved upon, iteratively, rapidly, with an enthusiasm that was, the analyst wrote, and the phrasing here is worth preserving, inconsistent with a species that should, by all metrics, have already surrendered. On day 14, Augustine's ground forces liberated the 309 Vreth soldiers that had been captured over the previous week, not to exchange them, not for negotiation. He released them with their equipment intact, and a recorded message, translated into Vreth by a linguistics professor named Dr. Nakamura, who had joined the operation on day 3, and had since become the Resistance's primary intelligence analyst, simply because she had been retired, was furious about it, and had a mind like a precision instrument. The message said, "We know where the rest of your fleet is. We know how long it will take to arrive. Go home. Tell them what you saw. Tell them what we did to your forces in 14 days with farming equipment and weather balloons, and then tell them this is a species that has not even started yet." It was, objectively, a bluff. They did not actually know where the rest of the fleet was, but Dr. Nakamura had written it, and Petra had approved it, and Augustine had delivered it with the absolute flat certainty of a man who had spent 14 days being completely correct about everything, and it landed with the force of documented fact. The Vreth Command Council received the message on day 15. They debated it for 4 days. They reviewed every operational report. They consulted the historical records of every previous conquest. They asked, seriously and at length, whether the threat assessment drone had been malfunctioning. On day 19, the fleet withdrew from Sector 7 Gamma. There was no announcement, no declaration. The ship simply left, which was so unlike standard Vreth procedure that Petra, watching the orbital signatures disappear from the tracking display Bow had assembled, said nothing for almost a full minute, and then quietly sat down on the floor. Toby Ferreira, who was standing next to her, also sat down on the floor. Then Bow, then Augustine, slowly, with the careful movements of a man who had not truly rested in 19 days, and whose body was beginning to file formal complaints. Yara sat down cross-legged and stared at the ceiling with the expression of someone who had done several things in the past 2 weeks that she would need a significant amount of time to fully process. Dr. Nakamura remained standing. She was looking at her notes. She had been compiling everything, every engagement, every adaptation, every piece of reverse-engineered Vreth technology, every communication pattern, every improvised solution, into a document that was already 400 pages long and growing. Petra looked up at her and said, "What are you writing?" Dr. Nakamura said, "Everything, because they'll come back, or someone else will, and when they do, I want to make sure we remember exactly what we are. What they were, for the record, was a pre-stellar species with projectile weapons, agricultural drones, weather balloons, and a mechanic who wouldn't stop working on a fuel coupling. They were also, and the rest of the galaxy would spend the next several decades coming to terms with this, a species that had just won. Not because they were the strongest, not because they had the best weapons or the most resources or the most advanced technology. They had won because of something that does not appear in any Vreth threat assessment rubric, that cannot be measured by a survey drone, that no conquest manual in the known galaxy had ever thought to account for. They were, when sufficiently annoyed, absolutely impossible to discourage. The Vreth Dominion filed the incident under a classification that translates, approximately, as anomalous outcome, cause undetermined. They updated the threat rating for Sector 7 Gamma from 0.1 to a number that made the assessment officer uncomfortable to type. They added a note to the file that read, in the careful, bureaucratic language of an organization that had just been thoroughly embarrassed by a planet full of farmers and administrators. Species demonstrates non-standard resistance escalation. Further engagement not recommended pending comprehensive behavioral analysis. Petra Okafor framed a copy of that note. It hung in her office for the rest of her life, next to a weather balloon and a slightly dented energy bar wrapper, above a small plaque that Yara had made her, which read, simply, "We said no."